Each week, we welcome to our NfG stage one of our highly talented members or special guests with something designed to help you and your business. Born and raised in Brighton, this week's guest is a Glasgow-based SEO consultant focused on getting traction through blogs, but with a history of getting traction on electric bikes. I just certainly hope that he doesn't make that journey on an electric Brompton. Sharing a passion for electric, he's fully charging ahead towards identifying ways to help businesses attain a net zero environmental impact and net zero bull. With the COP26 next month, a 2-week UN climate change conference in the town he lives, I'm sure that some of these top tips from the conference will be incorporated into his existing strategies to help small businesses to see the value of carbon neutrality and find easier ways to incorporate them. With an electrifying talk designed to help us get started on our journey to reach our net zero CO2 destination. We bring to you Adam Bastock. Good morning, Adam.
Morning, and thank you for that fantastic, I think, intro. I've never had one that's been quite so full of puns. I wish I had a counter going. So, yes, morning, everyone. As mentioned, we're here to kind of give you a real crash course and whistle-stop tour into net zero. So, where to start with net zero? As I mentioned, this is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. So, any questions, I think, put in the chat, and we'll come to them later. I'm hopefully going to just kind of really run through all of the key basics you need to know and to get started with. So, before I dive in, just quickly on who Small 99 are. So I am the founder of Small 99. We were built out of the idea and the passion that 99% of the UK economy is a small business that has less than 49 employees. 96%, and the figure is around 6 million companies now have less than 9. And the existing guidance that was out there for net zero was just not appropriate at all. It was all designed for large companies who've got big budgets and they've got staff to dedicate their time on this. Small businesses are the bulk of the economy and they need to be able to move faster and really tackle this issue. So our mission is to get 1 million small businesses to net zero by 2025. And that's, again, building off that fact that you can move really quickly as a small business owner and you have the opportunity to make change in a way that larger corporations can only dream of. Start with the basics. What is net zero? I think it's a term that's been thrown around quite a lot and it's really appeared in the past 2 years. So you'll be forgiven for not really knowing what it is. And essentially, it is the balance between greenhouse gas emissions and your offsetting activity. So what I mean by greenhouse gas emissions is it's more than just carbon. So that includes methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide, and some other really minor ones, which are very complicated and no one really knows about. It's all those ones bundled up, and the confusing thing is quite often carbon can be used colloquially to mean all those greenhouse gas emissions. The emissions offsetting is then what are you doing to draw down or to take carbon out of the atmosphere. We are expecting a more official definition from COP26, and that's one of the things that I'm really hoping will actually appear and come out, because at the minute it is slightly vague. So how is net zero measured? So net zero is measured in 3 different scopes. So you've got created, consumed, and then quite literally everything else. It's not a very helpful category. So scope 3 is combined of 15 different subcategories, which include the entire operators of your business. And for most small businesses, that's where 90% or more of your emissions are going to sit. So scope 1 emissions will be things like how many miles you drive. So a haulage company would have quite a lot of scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions will be your consumed. So things like your electricity bills to your premises and any energy you're using. Any kind of gas boilers you've got on site as well, that tends to be into scope 1. Scope 3, as I mentioned, is a wide category that is everything else. That includes upstream, so the things that you're purchasing, so the things you are buying to make your products and then sell on, and then also downstream. So those products and services, how are they being disposed of later down the line? So if you're selling mugs, where are you buying them from, and what happens once a customer breaks it? It's about that entire chain or life cycle of the products on your business. Scope 3 also includes things like website hosting, digital emissions, the pens you're using, the paper you're using, what your customers are doing with products. It's a real big category. There's also suppliers that are part of this, which we're going to come on to later. So just briefly to discuss net zero in slightly more commercial terms is I'd like to start thinking about it as break even. So at the minute we see on this graph on the left-hand side, you've got in the blue emissions, you might be spending 100 tons of carbon or CO2 every year in your business. You need to reduce that down and then balance it so that you are net zero or you've broken even in terms of your emissions. So if you're spending 100 tons a year, you want to reduce that down through different actions you can take, such as electric vehicles, etc., and then get to 20 tons a year of CO2. Once you've reduced down and demonstrated those reductions, you can then offset that with things like tree planting or other activities, and then that will take you to net zero. And then if you want to go beyond that to become kind of carbon negative, or again, carbon positive is sometimes used for this, which isn't helpful, but become even better, you can then do more offsetting and then overdo your impact and go beyond net zero. Or some people are saying go sub-zero, which I quite like as well. The idea here is just taking this, you need to demonstrate reductions. That's really the key theme with net zero. And just very quickly, something like carbon neutral, you don't have to demonstrate reductions, you can just offset straight away. So an example of this would be, I can't remember which company, it might have been Lidl or Tesco's, one of the two. There's a supermarket of some sort that said they're carbon neutral as of today. And all that means is that for their scope 1 and 2 emissions, they have bought a bunch of tree planting offsets. And that's how they're achieving that, but they're not net zero because they've not reduced those down yet. So just to expand a little bit more on what carbon offsetting is, because it's the key other half really to net zero. The idea being that you would go to a company and you would buy 1 ton of CO2 as a credit from that company, and that represents 1 ton of offsetting activity. They will then invest that in different activities such as tree planting, or it might be alternative fuel sources such as using renewables rather than kind of gas fire boilers and stuff like that. It can also be rewilding, and more interestingly, things like peatland restoration, where you end up having this environmental service, which is far more complete than just doing a single tree planting activity, mostly because it has other benefits to that area. It can be international or local, so it can either be, rewilding projects in the Scottish Highlands, which are quite common now, or it might be international things like mangrove trees, and I'm trying to think of other examples, but there's plenty of stuff going on around the world that your money will go much further with is an alternative. The idea being that then as those trees grow or the activity is done, that is creating an additional amount of carbon offsetting that would have otherwise existed. And it's very cheap and easy to do. That also brings us to some of the problems with carbon offsetting. Because it is cheap and easy to do, it's very easy to want to kind of rush to it and rely on it quite a lot, but there are some problems with it, so I just want to flag those very quickly. It's not always additional, so do we actually know that those trees wouldn't have been planted without what we've paid? So we need to demonstrate that there is a level of additionality, is the term I think, that we have created with our money, and therefore it's also very difficult to verify impact. So what if the tree doesn't grow? How do we know that that work is actually happening? It can be quite difficult to get full transparency on this, and that's why net zero is a much harsher criticism or a much harsher kind of measurement than carbon neutral, because you need to have demonstrated those reductions. So without reductions, you can't be claiming that, and that's why reduction is always best, because it's much easier to not do damage in the first place than it is to try and undo that damage. Tree planting broadly and carbon offsetting is normally a really good thing to do, but just don't rely on it too much, because if you rely on it quite heavily, you're going to struggle in the long term. A really good term that I heard it described as is a trade of indulgences, where it's a bit of a get out clause for your continuing activity. And with all, like, when you're looking at flights or car hire, and there's a little box that ticks that says, I'll make this carbon neutral with tree planting, and you tick that box for about £1, and suddenly all your guilt has gone away. You've traded your guilt and your indulgences away. So there's a good term I wanted to include here. So in terms of then knowing where you're actually at and where do you measure your emissions, there are broadly 3 different approaches to this, none of which are necessarily wrong, but I just think, again, different levels appropriate depending on where you're on your journey. So where Small 99 sits and what we don't necessarily measure, but what we try and do is provide broad industry guidance and templated recommendations based on industry-wide information on where typical emissions exist. So what we're doing is we're working with carbon offsetting, carbon measurement companies, taking a lot of their advice and bundling it up in a more consumable package for small businesses. That means that it's more accessible to you, but you don't need to pay and then hire an expensive consultant to get that information. The second level is spend or accounts based. So there's quite a few tools coming through on this now where they'll plug into your accounts packages, so Xero or Sage or something like that. And then they will take, based on the amount of money you're spending, they will multiply that by figures that they've got using their fancy software and give you a carbon footprint estimate based on those figures. That's quite handy for things like driving, especially because we have a very good idea of how much that is, and same with gas and electricity. It does get a little bit more inaccurate when you're looking at supply chains and suppliers, but I still think it's really useful because it brings that conversation point in to metrics you're already using. So rather than just putting a profit and loss report every couple of months, you then might also start including the carbon emissions data based on the the supply chain that you're working with. Again, well, actually, we're spending a lot of money with these, but we're also spending a lot of carbon with them. Finally, and the best way of tracking this, sorry, the most accurate way of tracking this, not necessarily the best, is activity-based. So this is where a company will come into your business and audit everything you do on an activity basis. Look at what you're doing daily, monthly, quarterly, etc., to really break down and pull your business apart and give you accurate information on your carbon footprint. That normally takes about 6 months, between 3 and 6 months to gather all the data up for that. But it will be at the end of that, you've got a fully accurate idea of where you're sat. It's also the most expensive option. There's another question here then around when should you measure? So do you measure first and then get started, or do you get started and then measure once you're on that journey? Again, not really a right or wrong answer here, but there's certainly a camp that I'm sat in. So the benefit of doing it before you get started is that you do get an accurate picture of everything you're doing. You can demonstrate clearer reductions. You go, right, we were at 100 tons, we're now at 20. Great, we've reduced 80 tons of CO2. And therefore that reduction looks much bigger and is going to help motivate your team and you just to keep on going with that. The downside is that will delay you. That might be months and months of emissions that could have otherwise been easily avoided that you're continuing to pump out. So the alternative camp is that you measure it after you've started. The downsides being you don't get a breakdown of progress, but it is more a cost-effective way of doing it. You are more likely to kind of keep momentum up because you're starting to build in those ways of changing and the approaches to net zero into your business. And it means that you make a much bigger impact much more quickly. And for small companies, especially where you're not necessarily going to go straight to an auditing company and spend £1,000, £2,000 or £3,000 with them to get an audit of your carbon footprint, you can just get started, do loads of stuff. And then once you've got a better understanding of your actions and emissions and ideas around that, you can then get an accurate audit to pick out the more difficult stuff. I've mentioned cost a few times there, so I want to just tackle that elephant in the room, which is always what's the cost of all this net zero stuff. And I think really we need to reframe this, and cost is the wrong word. This is an investment. It's about building a more resilient business. It's about building a better business that is going to be more attractive to either investors or to customers, whether you're business to business or business to consumer. And just having net zero is not going to go away. It's going to be in policy for the next few years, and therefore you need to be prepared for it now. In the short term, a lot of the actions to achieve net zero are about reducing waste, and reducing waste is also going to be reduced costs, and therefore it's going to save you quite a bit of money. And that's where there's also a huge opportunity to rethink how you're doing your business, to provide new services and new products that are just more efficient, cheaper, but also generally higher profit margins than the alternatives. I did do a talk on this, not to self-promote too much, but if you Google how to profit from net zero, there is a YouTube video of me going into this in more detail. And like the electric bikes intro is quite a good one of that's an entire sector and an entire way of thinking that didn't exist 5 years ago. And there's always going to be growth areas in this as we transition, because this is the biggest planned economic change for centuries. So it's a case of when, not if. So where do you start? So to rattle through a few different ideas here, and one of the key ones is reduce, don't replace. This is a real annoyance of mine that kind of makes me quite frustrated with a lot of business owners when they think of this, is that plastic free is not carbon free. Just because a product doesn't have plastic in it does not mean that the carbon footprint of it is lower. Your consumption of that is still going to include carbon somewhere along the line, and therefore it's far more important to reduce your usage overall rather than keeping existing behaviors, which mean that you're just swapping out one material for another. An example being, which carrier bag is best? Is quite a common one that I've been asked on webinars. And just to put some figures here, so a cotton bag is around 233 grams of CO2. A paper bag is around 12 grams of CO2. A plastic bag is around 3 grams. So incredibly light, and plastic is a great material for this. So it's very low carbon in the grand scheme of things. So the best option really is to go with, we don't offer bags at all. You just ask your customers to bring their own, and then that is 0 grams of CO2 option, because everyone's got carrier bags or bags that they already have, and encouraging that behavior is going to be far more beneficial. And then maybe you offer some paper bags or something like that, alternatively for the lower usage. So this is really about changing the mindset and going, well, rather than just thinking the easy thing for me to do is, rather than using a plastic water bottle, I'll use a metal one, is go, well, actually, how am I consuming water? Why am I consuming this? Do I need a new thing to try and fix this? Or actually, is it more of a behavior trait that I just need to adjust? So as part of scope 3, I mentioned suppliers earlier. And these are your suppliers are typically going to be, 80 to 90% of your actual total carbon emissions. So these are all the companies that you buy services from, whether it's digital, whether it's physical, just everyone there, everyone you're working with. It's always going to be the biggest challenge. And I think it's the one that you should start trying to tackle straight away, because it's going to be, well, it's never going to be done. It's always going to be something that is going to be ongoing. And therefore, the sooner you build it into your decision making, the more quickly you're going to actually achieve it. The problem really with the supply chain is that you don't control their emissions. You can't have an impact and physically go into their business and change what they're doing. So the simplest thing that I would start asking them is, do they have an environmental policy? Or ask to see their environmental policy and assume they have one. That includes everybody and includes digital as well. So there's plenty of very nice headliney stats flying around that, the internet is more carbon intensive or produces more emissions than flying does. And that's just because there is so much energy being consumed here. And currently the energy grids are so kind of carbon rich, which isn't necessarily a good thing. And we need to reduce down the amount of energy being consumed, and therefore switching to alternative suppliers for your email hosting or for your web hosting, etc., is a great way to align your supply chain with your mission and your goals. And therefore, as they reduce their emissions down, yours will also in turn reduce. Flipping that over, if you're working with a company who's just building a new coal-fired plant, your emissions as a company are going to increase as they go on their path. So you don't want to be working with people who are basically working against you. The way to do that is to be thoughtful. So every decision you make in the business, before you hit that buy button online, or before you look at a new supplier for, as you say, whether it's web hosting or electric vehicles or cars for your office, or even offices themselves, or if you're moving office, is challenge your decision on that and go, well, what are they doing? Are they aligned to net zero? Do they have any commitment to net zero at all? What is it? And are they at least on that journey? I'm not saying here that they need to be net zero, because very few companies are. It's more about, are they actually on that journey and have they committed to this? Are they working in the same direction as I am? Changing your mindset. So just to expand on that a little bit more, this is really about building momentum into your business, into daily activities. So treat carbon emissions as a finite resource. Imagine you've got a carbon budget of 20 tons a year. Start thinking as if, what is the carbon cost of this business? I can spend those 20 tons because I know I'm offsetting them through very verified schemes. So, that might mean that you do still drive a petrol car because you can't afford an electric one. That is fine, but you then need to go, where are you saving that carbon from? Where are you making allowance for that budget? If you're spending the carbon on that one thing that you can't remove, where else in your supply chain, where else in your activities are you actually going to find that carbon budget from? There's two challenges here, two very quick stories. One, I think, is the envelope challenge, which is more around, if you're about to buy some new envelopes off eBay for 10, 15 pounds, why don't you think, rather than going, well, let's buy some eco ones, just think, do I need to send envelopes at all? Why do I need envelopes? Do I actually need to send letters out? Is that the most effective way of doing this? And certainly in e-commerce businesses, I see this a lot with like delivery slips. No one uses delivery slips. They just go straight to recycling. So just remove them out of the process entirely. Secondly, is the kebab challenge. So this is a story that someone said to me where they were buying a kebab in a kebab shop after a night out, and got handed it in a paper bag, and then the kebab was wrapped in paper with loads of paper serviettes and like a knife and fork that was all wooden. So looks great because it is all recyclable, it's all very eco-friendly, etc. But the point being, he's about to eat that kebab immediately. That paper bag is pointless. The paper around the kebab is also pretty pointless. The only thing he really needs is the serviette to then eat the kebab with. So it's about thinking of the process and go, what is the user experience here? How can we reduce down as much as possible what we're doing so that we don't build in these extra emissions, all this extra consumption? And that's going to also save the kebab shop owner cost in terms of buying all these paper bags, which people are just walking straight out the door and binning immediately. Communication, I think, is really key, and one that most business owners are failing on, just because it's quite a scary topic and no one really knows what's going on at the minute. There's not much government guidance on this. So one of the things I would do is write a policy. And you may have seen, obviously, before the How to Write a Sustainability Policy course. This is a big problem that I'm trying to solve, where it's just about demonstrating to other people what you're doing. And in doing so, you're going to attract more business. It's going to build more trust with you, and you can join others on their net zero journey. So you want to be honest and transparent with your entire supply chain, with your customers, to make sure that they know what you're up to, even if that isn't necessarily a good thing. A lot of business owners, especially, are in similar situations to you, where they don't control their office heating, they don't control their office energy suppliers, they can't do everything, they can't influence everything. but I want to see people admitting that and saying that they've at least looked at it. I think that's so much more important, because no one's going to be perfect in this space. Even the people who are 5 years ahead of others on their net zero journey aren't perfect. They've still got a lot of things they need to tackle, but as long as you can demonstrate that you've at least thought about it and you've tried, I think that's really vital. And so if you are writing a policy, just building it around what you can do and what you can't do is a great start and a great way to do it. And it doesn't need to be legally binding or anything like that. It's just somewhere to go. You know, are you taking this seriously? Do you have targets, etc.? There's my recommendations of where to start. And just very quickly before we finish off, I want to run through some net zero busting myths. So one is a common question I get asked is, can you make a difference? Which is the most frustrating one, because as I said earlier, there are 99% of businesses in the UK are less than 49 employees. That is a number of around 6 million companies. So even if every one of those only reduced their carbon footprint by 2 tons, that's 12 million tons of CO2 a year, which, you know, I think it was something like 5% of UK's emissions. There's a lot you can do here with relatively minor adjustments and minor changes. This is the hugest cohort of people. We can act very quickly on this. Legal obligations are coming in for large corporations. I won't bore you with the details, but there is a task force for climate disclosures group who work with corporations to basically forecast and plan their emissions and their climate risks 10, 15, 20 years in the future. As part of that, they are then going to be looking at their supply chain going, well, where do the weaknesses, where do the risks lie with people who are not meeting net zero targets and are therefore contributing to an instability in our business? And they're then going to be wanting to remove those companies and replace them with companies who are actually more resilient and much better. I think COVID and Brexit has both really highlighted a lot of issues with supply chains, just in so many different ways. And bigger corporations are really aware of that. And therefore they are looking for, again, reducing costs and reducing consumption in the first place is a great way to achieve net zero, but it also means they're just far more resilient to those supply chain issues. As I mentioned, Scope 3 emissions are a problem for them. They're also going to be looking to try and reduce their emissions down. So if you look at someone like Starbucks, they've got their public audit available. It's 96% of their supply of their emissions are Scope 3 in that, you know, other person, other everything else category. So don't just think that Scope 3 emissions are a small business thing. Small businesses can also move enviously quickly, and I think COVID really proved that when we were at the start of the pandemic, and it was suddenly seeing Pret really struggle because they've built their business model on a certain way for the past 6 years and can't change it around very quickly. But then the small local coffee shops who are in, you know, high streets or what's the word, like kind of urban centers around residential areas suddenly started flourishing and having a much better time because they were able to respond to that demand far more quickly. So there is a lot of positives, I think, to take over the past 2 years, and just how small businesses can respond and act much quicker than larger corporations. Another common question, how long will it take? So if you put your mind to it, significant reductions can happen in about 6 months. That is especially true for professional services where you're not going to have a huge footprint, and therefore even a modest amount of carbon offsetting and some reductions is going to help you achieve net zero quite quickly. It does get harder when you're renting and when you're not in complete control over everything, but again, that's something that we're expecting to change, and if you can't do it, that's fine. Move on to the next thing. 2025 is realistic. It's what, 4 years away now, and I think if I asked a lot of you guys if you could reduce your electricity usage or asked you to change how much you're spending on marketing in the next 4 years, you would laugh and say, well, I can probably do it by next week. So I think really it is the ambition here and the ability for you to move very quickly. Even 2030 for most micro and small businesses, I don't think is particularly relevant. Even some larger small businesses that I've come across who are in manufacturing, they still are achieving 2022, 2023 targets because they've been very aggressive with this idea, and it's helped save their business. Very quickly as well, I just wanted to tackle 4 kind of elephants in the room here around climate delay versus climate denial, which is something I've seen a lot more of recently, where we're now moving away from climate denial, where I think everyone knows that climate change is a thing. It's been proven so many times. We're kind of beyond that now. But we're now moving into climate delayism, which is a far more dangerous territory because it means that people are not taking action because they think it's someone else's problem. And that inaction falls into 4 rough categories, which I just wanted to address and for you to challenge yourself with this over the next few months and years as COP26 fires up more communication around this. So there's redirection of responsibility. So this whole idea that BP made the carbon footprint popular means that, oh, it's not my problem to fix it. When it's like, okay, well, it's not ideal that BP made it popular, but it is now popular and it's still a really useful tool. So use that and just get on with it. Two, policy perfectionism. So people are really wanting every alternative technology and every alternative policy to be absolutely perfect. And again, I think an electric car is a good example here where people think that the new electric vehicles coming through should be completely emissions free and, should be magical and not have any emissions in generating the steel that goes into them. That's just not true, and that they are still far better than the alternative. And done is better than perfect. So don't focus too much on perfectionism and really think about what's practical. Surrender. So another one is it's too late. There is no time limit for this. Things will either go from bad to extremely bad. So it's about minimizing the impacts we have in terms of that climate change. And as I said, you can move incredibly quickly and therefore just get on with it. And number 4 is technological optimism. So waiting on non-existent future solutions. That's probably a whole talk in itself, but I think green hydrogen to a certain extent and things like relying on saying we should build more nuclear power stations and things like that is kind of overly hopeful. And I think technology is going to be part of the solution, but it's not the only solution. We need to be doing a lot more here. So don't just use that as an excuse to go, let's wait until this technology comes around, because then you are part of the problem, not part of the solution. And everyone likes being part of the solution. And very quickly, just to finish off the last slide really on why should you go to net zero and recap some of the topics we've said here, because I think it does sound like quite a lot of effort. And is it worth it? Simply, it's more profit. Reduction is less cost. You're more likely to win more businesses and contracts, and that's going to be coming through over the next 2-3 years. And as our taxes, carbon taxes are going to be coming again, don't know when, but it's something that is going to happen. We're starting to see that already with the plastic packaging tax and the coal taxes from 2012. That has all ramped up, and that's why we've seen so much progress in terms of the usage of coal in the UK energy grid. If you can start reducing down now, it means that you're not going to be exposed to those taxes in the future. You just dodge that bullet entirely because you're already in the best shape you can be, and therefore you can be more resilient. So just to give some very quick examples here, if you are using an electric vehicle in your commercial deliveries, you're resilient to fuel shortages. You can still keep delivering because you've got a warehouse that's got vans plugged in and charging overnight. You're removing yourself from that need to rely on external factors. Also, better insulation in your premises, which is again another common net zero goal, is going to protect you against rising gas costs. So if you're using less gas overall, you're just not going to need to worry about that costs quite so much. And again, there's a big shortage of cardboard last year, which was quite interesting with the lockdowns, where people were hoarding it in their garages and not getting it delivered to offices, which meant that all the cardboard was sitting in domestic streams rather than in business streams, which meant that the cost of cardboard went up about 4 times, I think. So it was about £120 a ton, up from £30 a ton, just because it wasn't going into the cycle. And that shortage meant that if you're using a lot of cardboard in your packaging because you hadn't reduced it down, hadn't rethought how can I reduce these costs down, you're just more resilient against it. So some examples there. So what now? I think this is one of the tools I've kind of developed as one of the ways to get a quick set of ideas around your carbon footprint. It's a non-technical impact report that is a conversation starter, on where to increase profit and start reducing your emissions. And then from that, you'll get weekly emails and guidance on what you need to tackle. So if you go to small99.co.uk/measure, you'll get a nice shiny pie chart with green and red, or hopefully mostly green areas on your business and some ideas on where to go from there. And that is me. So over to the Q&A now.